All right, good. All right, well then I'll look at the camera.
Okay, good. I can't do that. I still need to read. Anyway, we are recording now, Ian, and I
Okay,
just
great.
wanted to start.
Good meeting you.
Just to start by saying thank you for agreeing to do this for our students at Waterloo. We'll use it over the next couple of years, and I think it'll help a lot of the people that we have who come primarily from technical, engineering, mathematics type degrees to understand the context of the work that they're going to be doing when they go out to work. So This is quite valuable for us.
Good.
So the first question I've got for you is, could you please introduce yourself to the students and tell us how your career led up to the role that you have now at Oxford?
Well, I'm the director of the Oxford Martin School, and I'm Professor of Globalization at Oxford University. And I've been here for 5 years, so this is a new creation in Oxford. It's a startup, the Oxford Martin School. It's an interdisciplinary faculty now of about 350 people from 25 different disciplines working on the big issues of the future. And I encourage you to look at the website oxfordmartin.ox.ac.uk to get more information. Prior to this, I was vice president at the World Bank. I've had a long and winding career. I've never had a job for more than 5 years. This is the longest job actually I've had. I'm just going into my 6th year now. I was vice president there on the executive committee, and also prior to that, I was head of policy for the bank group. So my interest has always been development. I'm interested in trying to work out what policies can help poor people, what can lead to inclusive globalization. And I went to the World Bank after having lived in South Africa from 1995 to 2001. I'm originally from South Africa. I went into exile in 1978. I left South Africa fighting against apartheid, and then went back, had the huge honor of being invited by President Mandela to go back to run the State Bank, which is a regional bank covering 15 countries of Southern Africa. So I was chief executive and managing director of that from effectively the end of 2005 to 2001, and I was also advisor to President Mandela. I traveled with Mandela to many places. Unfortunately, I didn't get to Waterloo or even to Canada, but went to Washington and London and Paris, Japan with him, working on the economic side of things. The work I did in South Africa was really, again, focusing on development policy, on investment, infrastructure investments. We created about 25,000 small businesses a year through helping them develop, and also working on some of the big policy issues around these things, around finance. That was my day job. My night and weekend job was advising the government and the president, and then I also sat on various boards. Amongst the things I really enjoyed doing is I was finance director for South Africa's Olympic bid, and learned the lessons from Montreal, I hope, in putting that together. As you know, that bid didn't go anywhere. It would have been actually this year. Prior to that, I was at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. This could take the whole session, just going through my... I was at the European Bank for Reconstruction as principal economist, and prior to that I was at the OECD in Paris as a program director there. And so that's really my career. Did a doctorate at Oxford and a master's at LSE before that.
Fascinating career, and to be involved in the things that you have been would have been a wonderful thing to be able to do. But what I wanted to ask you about next was, what do you see as the main elements of globalization? You've been close to, it would appear, a lot of the things that have happened with globalization recently. What would you say were the main characteristics of it?
Well, I think that globalization, well, let's first define it. By globalization, I mean increasing integration between societies, increasing openness and connectivity between societies. And I think that is an inevitable in a way, part of the technological change, the political and ideological change that's really accelerated. It's gone through waves in history. It really accelerated after 1990 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the opening up of China, the ending of dictatorships, including in my country, South Africa, an autocratic government that was cut off in South Africa. But also ideological opening, not least in China, and of course a lot of things happening in capital markets, like the reduction of capital controls and trade liberalization, reduction in trade barriers, as well as a facilitation due to technology. So containerization, fiber optics, these things were extremely significant. It can be reversed. There have been periods in history where it has been reversed. I think it's the most powerful positive force in the history of humanity to lift people out of poverty, to bring people opportunity, education, knowledge, things they need, like, let's say, vaccines or food. So it can be the most powerful positive force. It is the reason why societies are accelerating and catching up in many emerging markets, but it's also a very dangerous force. And if it's not managed properly in policy or by the actors like the multinational companies that engage in it, if it's not properly understood by all of us, it can be misused. So it's been the underbelly of globalization, unfortunately, has been growing inequality and also some major systemic risks, which are now spreading very rapidly. The financial crisis is a very clear example of the underbelly of globalization. So too is the potential for a rapid spread in new global threats like pandemics, and of course the rapid increase in climate change as a result of the success, in a sense, of globalization in the economic growth of many countries, and as well as be able to distribute energy systems around the world, petroleum. So my view is that globalization is a very positive force. It needs to be managed to be more inclusive. I don't see it as a threat. I don't think it leads to homogenization. The French used to worry that everyone would be eating McDonald's and wearing Levi's in France. Last time I checked, France is as French as it has ever been. Indeed, what globalization has done is led to a widening of the attraction of Frenchness, so that there are more people attracted to that. The French restaurants and French movies are doing better than they ever have been. And that's true of all societies. Some societies have virtually disappeared, like the Armenian societies have recreated themselves through globalization by connecting with their diaspora that survived outside Armenia. So it's not necessarily a destructive force, but it can be. And what I feel very strongly about, and that's why I've written a lot about this, I'm spending a lot of time researching at the moment, is how does one make globalization work? How does one make it work for poor people? How does one reduce the risks associated with it? How do you make it a powerful force for good, rather than something that undermines what we want to achieve for humanity? So that's the challenge. I think those that simply say stop globalization have it quite fundamentally wrong, because that's also about stopping progress in many parts of the world. So I don't think it's about stopping it. I think it's about working out what policies can make it more effective.
So you've been doing some work on those policies. What sort of areas are you looking at, and what types of solutions are there that would give you cause for what would appear to be optimism about globalization?
So I have a book coming out in mid-February which is called Globalization for Development, Meeting New Challenges, and the chapters are on finance, on trade, on aid, on migration, on ideas. And that's sort of what I see as the 5 principal dimensions of globalization that I feel a competence to work on. There are obviously many other cultural and other dimensions, but as an economist, I think those are best left to those that know more about them. So clearly, trade is absolutely essential. I've been very involved in trade negotiations, in that creating a level playing field. It's absolutely obscene that the rich countries subsidize and protect their agriculture, to the tune of something like $300 billion a year. That's bigger than the GDP of sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa. A cow in Switzerland gets a higher per capita subsidy than any African does. That's about $5 per capita now per day. These are crazy numbers, and it makes it impossible for poor people to compete. So protectionism in agriculture is very dangerous. And by the way, the biofuels backdoor protectionism is an equally bad thing as far as I'm concerned. Pretending that one is helping climate change by encouraging your farmers to grow rapeseed or oil seeds and things. This is bad for the environment. Ag subsidies, backdoor protectionism, that's the phytosanitary and other things. We obviously have to care about the quality of our food, but this is being used in absurd ways to keep containers of fruit off coasts until they rot and things like that. So non-tariff barriers, very important on trade. Other interesting areas like intellectual property are very important as well, and how one understands the intellectual property regime to encourage innovation, encourage people to invest in research, but not lead to monopolistic practice, particularly in things which are vital for humanity, like anti-HIV, AIDS drugs. So trade is a key area of globalization. Finance is a key area. How does one create a financial system that actually leads to investment for poor people, for ordinary people, for small businesses? How does one make the finance system something which is global, so you can access capital globally, but doesn't globally spread risk? Is an absolutely key question, not least when you get the demographic and other dimensions, old people needing to draw on their pensions and suddenly find that there's nothing there, for example. But also young people coming into the labor markets needing to buy a house, needing to get a student loan, and of course poor people needing to start businesses and needing to get by. So finance is an absolutely key thing, and what we've seen is rather than spreading of the wonderful depth and breadth of finance, this very, very unhealthy focus in a number of key areas through the derivatives and other markets, which were meant to spread risk and instead concentrated risk. So understanding globalization, understanding the systemic risks associated with it, but as well as the potential depths and breadth of what it could offer is absolutely vital. Aid is very important. It's another flow. I'm a very strong believer that there should be much more aid and much higher quality aid. This is about both volume and quality. A lot of the debate seems to imply there's some sort of trade-off. Clearly, one should not be supporting bad governments. One should not be supporting projects where the money ends in Swiss bank accounts. But there are now fantastic ways of doing this. There's been a huge amount of learning over the last 50 years of aid. The developing countries have never been better governed. Although it might seem a bit bizarre to us going through a crisis, the rich countries have never been richer. And it's sort of crazy that in this environment, the amount we give them as a share of our GNP, and I'm not talking about Canada here, which has been trying to do some good things, but is lower than it was in 1975 when the promises were made to go to 0.7% of GNI. So aid is very important. How aid goes, harmonization of aid, so we don't have each country trying to put up its flag outside its own white elephant hospital, is vital. So harmonizing together. The Tanzanian finance minister has to cater for something like 20,000 annual visits of donor agencies. Can you imagine? He has no time to get on with his job. Harmonizing systems, harmonizing approaches, getting behind the right people and supporting progressive actions is vital. And also thinking about this as a wider thing. A lot of aid money has been wasted on technical assistance. A lot of aid money has been wasted in other ways. There's also a vital need for aid for what I call public goods. So things like intellectually property, international ag research system, for example, malaria vaccinations, other projects which would eliminate things which spread across borders, which the aid agencies don't always fund them. So aid is a very important aspect of globalization. Migration is the most neglected, perhaps, of the dimensions of globalization. Historically, migration is the source of civilization. It is the source. I can hear from your accent, I think you're a migrant too. You can ask your class to put up their hands as to how many of them are either first or second generation migrants. But what we know now from this great new development of research that's coming out is how important migration has been for economic growth and development around the world, and also that it has been the way historically that people have always escaped risk, poverty, famine, war, etc. That's how people survived, and if our ancestors hadn't survived, we would not exist as a species. It's very deep, it's very important, and the proliferation of nation states over the last 100 years and increasing strength of border controls that have been associated with it, passports are only 100 years old, this has led to people being trapped in poverty and risk. And so I've just done another book called Exceptional People, which Princeton University Press have just published. It's called Exceptional People, How Migration Shaped Our World and Will Define Our Future. And what that is basically is what I'm trying to show is how important it has been. And this is the neglected side of globalization. It's the orphan of the international system. There's no international organization. There's no UN system for migration. The data are terrible. Small changes in migration policy, like a 3% increase in the number of unskilled workers that a country would accept, would lead to much greater impacts on poverty. There are big issues and complications like the brain drain, for example, very important issues around remittances, which are probably, that's what migrants send home. They're probably 6 times the level of aid flows, double the level of investment flows, so very big numbers. What can be done with these? What aspects of the policies around these could be improved to enhance globalization? And the final dimension of globalization, which I focus on because I think it's also an economic dimension, is ideas. Ideas have always been the most powerful force for economic progress in the world. They're the most powerful force for change. Not all ideas are good. There's a war of ideas. There's some very bad ideas out there. There have been bad ideas in the past. And the struggle between good and bad ideas is the really interesting struggle in globalization as well. And one can do thought experiments and ask oneself, of all the forces in globalization, of all the dimensions of openness and integration, which is how I think about globalization, what is more important, the actual goods and services, or even the people, or the ideas that are bundled up with that and come in the media as well and other things? And I believe it's ideas. That's what really changes things. And so how do you harvest ideas? How do you increase the output of good ideas, accelerate the evolution of ideas that are good, and decelerate in a way the bad ideas? And of course there are some various obvious things like education as a base for that. So how do you create the absorptive capacity, and what is the relationship between your own ideas and ideas that come from elsewhere? So how do you adapt ideas, innovate around them, make them real for your own environment, learn from old ideas and recreate them for the new? So in economics, there's, and at Waterloo, as part of this, there's a very strong need for new ideas. And it's a profession which is new. It's a profession that is evolved rapidly, but is not in a very good place at the moment in terms of its ability to contribute positive ideas which will solve the world's problems and actually slow down some of these bad ideas which are adding to the problems. So the group in SIGI and others in Waterloo are part of something that we also involved in the Institute for New Economic Thinking, for example, which is on one dimension is trying to do this, but it's a much broader thing. So those are some of the different elements. I think what we need to understand is that the hyperconnectivity that globalization brings leads to a very rapid transmission of all of these things. And if you look at the flows of all of these things, they have orders of magnitude greater than they were 20 years ago. That's the good news. The bad news is that the transmission of shocks is also, and the dangers associated with hyperconnectivity, in other words, systemic risk, is also orders of magnitude greater. The remarkable thing about globalization was, though it has transformed fundamentally over the last 20 years, the system of governance has not evolved with it. And so there's a widening and yawning gap between the actual structures of globalization, the flows across borders, and the capacity of the system to manage it, which is basically nation states on the one hand, who are actually, I think, worse than they used to be because they focus on short-term crises and crisis management. Amongst other things, there were some other reasons they're worse. They effectively, the media and the incentive structures have denuded the leadership capability of the nation state. And then you have the global system, which is the Bretton Woods institutions, the UN, and a few others who are totally unfit for 21st century purpose for all sorts of reasons. And this gap between, on the one hand, what's actually happening on the ground with globalization and all these, I just cited 5 dimensions, but there are many other dimensions, the risks and the opportunities of that, and then this incapable system of managing it. Now, if we're to harvest the opportunity, we're going to need global management. If we're going to mitigate the risks, systemic risks, be they climate change, pandemics, financial crises, whatever, we're going to need global management. And if you want to know where I'm heading on globalization, it's we've got to very urgently wake up to this widening gap and do something about it.
So you've talked about our weaknesses in predicting the current economic crisis, and so the next question I've got might be more difficult in the sense that for the people who are now in their 20s, when they get up towards their 60s, it's a long way ahead, and I think I would hesitate to make a lot of predictions that far ahead. But do you have any sense of what the world might be like in the future? I wouldn't say necessarily 40 years, but what do you see happening? If you had to put your money where your mouth is, what's going to happen in the future?
Yeah, well, predictions are always dangerous, especially about the future. And the Oxford Martin School it's got a lot of people working on different dimensions of the future, doing research, inventing the future, as it were. But we don't predict. There's a great book called Bad Predictions, which is just every page, and it's about a 300-page book, has about 10 bad predictions on it. And what's interesting about this is that the smartest people in the smartest institutions, the Bill Gateses of this world, the Thomas Edisons of this world, all of these people, you look at their projections of the future and they just get it fundamentally wrong. As well as these big economists, of course, are spectacularly bad at this as well. The IMF famously predicting, or infamously predicting right before the financial crisis that everything was fine. What worries me is that that's the best information system there is, with the best people. I mean, as you'll know, these are the sort of global elite of governance, the IMF and the central banks, the finance ministries. These are the strongest part of national and global governance with the strongest data sets, and yet they get it completely wrong. So I'm not going to predict it. What I would say is a number of fundamental structural forces are pretty, to me, clear. One is, I think we will see the demography, although it too is unpredictable. If you look at the longevity and fertility data, that's very powerful. Fertility is collapsing. I think it will continue to collapse. Longevity is increasing. Just while we're having this conversation, your average life expectancy of your students should increase by about 5 minutes. So these are pretty strong forces on average. Of course, the average doesn't tell you what's going to happen to the individual, and that carries with it a number of things. I think the remarkably change in economic growth rates and opportunities in emerging markets versus the OECD, I think, is sustainable for the next 20, 30 years. In other words, we will grow the old rich countries, Canada again an exception for various reasons, But we'll grow maybe 20% of the growth rate of emerging markets. And when you compound that sort of growth rate in China or even in India on average, you get to some startling outcomes over a 20, 30, 40-year period, with China basically having the average income of the south of Europe now, for example, Portugal countries, Greece, countries like that. So a number of these forces, I think, are evident. We don't know where the world population will peak, but my guess is that it's going to actually peak sooner and come down quicker than people imagine, around 9 to 10 billion and coming down by 2050, with very, very high increases in dependency ratios. And so the interesting question is who's going to pay our pensions, who's going to look after us? The medical technologies are absolutely astounding. We have great groups here in Oxford, in the Oxford Martin School, but the neuroscience is lagging behind the physical regeneration and capacity. So I see, I think your students are going to be okay. They are unlikely to have to worry about dementia and Alzheimer's, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to worry about that. And I'm going to need someone to push me around in my wheelchair, and where this person going to come from. So these demographic and health trends are pretty structural, I think. I think the Moore's law increase in computing power over this period is also quite stable for the next 20 years. That means that you have 1 million times improvement in the power of whatever your handheld device is for the same price in maybe 15 or so years' time. What do you do with it? How does it operate? The nano trends, I think, are pretty stable. Miniaturization, molecular manufacturing, incredible. So invisible things in your body, in the atmosphere, with data sensors. What do you do with it? How do you use this? How does it change the world? Opportunity and risk. There's no doubt that in our lifetimes even, we should be able to eliminate poverty and disease, and most of the diseases we know, like malaria and other terrible things. The technological capability must be there. At the same time, is it going to happen, or are we going to see widening disparity, more poverty, desperation, climate change-induced risk increasing, etc.? And that's where you get into where science and the possible hits the politics. I hate to say it, but Canada's position on climate change is Canada's self-interest. And in the end, people don't act in the global interest, they act in their national interest, or they act even in their short-term national interest. And so that's a big question. And it's where economists sort of has to put a full stop.
Absolutely. So we're coming to the end of your time, Ian. Yeah. We just had half an hour. But the last thing I wanted to do was to give you the opportunity to say some final words to the students. They're in there coming towards the end of their degrees. They'll be going out to work soon or on to postgraduate work. And I'd like to ask the people who talk to the class really just to give any special words of advice, or maybe not special, but just words of advice that you would give to them.
Well, that's very kind of you, and thank you for inviting me to participate. I hope it's useful for you and all your students. And my advice would be that we're at a crossroads. I think everyone always says that this time is special, but I think to be a student now is the best time ever in the history of humanity. To be in that position, I think the possibilities in our lifetimes, but particularly the younger generation, students' lifetimes, are greater than ever before. I really do believe that this could be a time when humanity deals with many of the issues which have troubled us for time immemorial in a constructive way. So the potential exists to, and I gave 2 examples, eliminate poverty and disease of many types, for example. The potential exists for everyone in the world to really be essentially middle class in some respect, to have a decent life, not to worry about hunger, not to worry about heating and things like that. That potential exists, I have no doubt, in the life of the students. But the potential also exists for the first time in the history of humanity for us to wreck this planet in a more comprehensive way than we've ever been able to do before. And interestingly enough, for very small numbers of people, perhaps even 2 or 3 people, to create mayhem through biopathogens and other mechanisms that technology has allowed in way before. So the need for inclusiveness, the need for worrying about what other people do and how they're doing has never been greater, because they could wreck everyone's future. So I think it's a very, very important time to not only go out and do things and live a good life and hopefully do things for yourself and for your loved ones in ways that are meaningful to you, but also worry about the other. Worry about the other and worry about what's happening out there. And make decisions which might not always seem to be the easiest ones, because it will definitely be, I think, better for everyone in the long run. So good luck. It's going to be, I think, be a fascinating and very bumpy ride. I think we're riding a tidal wave here of change. But it's one that if we keep our wits about us and do effectively, will be the most fantastic and exciting time to be riding.